The auctioneer had to repeat the figure twice before anyone believed it, and even then the laughter came before the silence did $2. That was the whole of it. The sum a thin young woman with chapped hands and a man's wool coat had laid on the plank table at the foot of the levee, and for it she had bought a thing the river was already taking back. The houseboat sat low in the brown current at the edge of the Yazoo landing, its hull half swallowed, its deck canted toward the water, like a man leaning to be sick. No one else had bid. The men along the bank had come to watch the spectacle of a vessel sinking by inches, not to own it, and when the auctioneer asked for an offer he had meant it as a joke. Clara Hale did not take it as one. She set down $2 silver, the last she had in the world, and she said she would take the boat and whatever the boat held. The men laughed. The river did not. This was the spring of 1887, in the lower Mississippi Delta, where the Yazoo runs into the larger water above Vicksburg, a country of mud and willow and cypress that gave nothing freely and took whatever it could reach. The landing was called Stell's Bend, a half-rotted collection of warehouses and a single store, the kind of place that existed because a riverboat had once needed somewhere to put down freight and had since mostly stopped coming. Clara had arrived there on foot 11 days before, having walked the last 40 miles from the railhead at Greenwood, with everything she owned in a flour sack and a leather roll of tools that had belonged to a dead man. She had no people in that country. She had no people anywhere, not anymore. And she had come to the river because a letter, the last letter her grandfather ever sent her, had named this bend and this boat, and had asked her, in the careful hand of a man who had taught her every honest thing she knew, to come and see what he had left. What was locked below the waterline of that sinking houseboat would, before the summer ended, undo a man who had spent 30 years believing himself untouchable. That, though, is the end of the matter, and the river teaches patience before it teaches anything else. Stay with this one. The thing a person throws away tells you more about them than the thing they keep, and what this man had thrown away was about to speak. Clara Hale was 28 years old that spring, and she had the look of someone who had been made lean by work rather than by want, though she had known both. She was not tall. She stood a little under 5.5 feet, with the kind of squared shoulders that come from years of lifting, and her hands, which were the first thing a careful observer noticed, were scarred across the knuckles and stained dark in the creases with something that would not wash out. Her hair was a dark brown going to auburn where the sun caught it, and she wore it pinned up out of her way. Her face was plain and steady, and gave little away. She had learned long ago that a woman alone on the river did better to be underestimated than admired, and she dressed and moved accordingly, in a cream calico dress gone soft with washing and a red wool shawl her grandmother had made, the one bright thing she owned. The dead man whose tool she carried was her grandfather, Elias Hale, and he had been a riverboat carpenter and a builder of strong boxes and a maker of fine cabinetry for 40 years. Before a fever took him in a boarding house in Memphis with Clara holding his hand, he had raised her after her mother died, raised her in the bottom of a workshop that smelled of cedar shavings and linseed oil, and he had taught her, without ever once saying it was unusual to teach such things to a girl, how to read the grain of a board and the wear of a lock and the secret logic of a thing built to keep other things safe. He used to say that any fool could build a box. The skill, he told her, was in building one that told no one it had a bottom under its bottom. She had not understood him then. She would understand him before the summer was out. The men at Stell's Bend knew none of this. They saw a woman with $2 and a leaking boat, and they made the jokes such men make. The auctioneer, a heavy, florid man named Otis Pruitt, who took a commission on every sale at the Bend and resented one that earned him almost nothing, told her she now owned the only vessel in Mississippi that came with its own grave already dug. A man in a stovepipe hat said she had paid $1 a foot for water. Clara folded her receipt and put it in her satchel and walked down the slick bank to look at what she had bought, and behind her, the laughter trailed off into the ordinary noise of the river, which has no opinion of anyone. The houseboat was perhaps 30 feet long, a flat-bottomed shanty craft of the kind families had once lived aboard while they worked the timber camps, a low cabin set on a barge hull, the whole of it built of cypress that had silvered with age. It had been a handsome thing once. She could see that in the joinery even now, in the way the cabin corners were fitted and the door frame was set square. Whoever built it had known the trade. Now, though, it had been left tied to a half-sunk piling for a long time, and the hull had opened somewhere below, and the boat sat with its stern deck awash and its bow tilted up, and the brown water moving slow and patient through the lower cabin. A bird had nested in the eave of the cabin roof and abandoned it. The mooring rope had grown a green beard of algae where it met the water, and a young willow had taken root in the silt, caught against the stern rail, and stood there, waving its thin leaves, the way a tree will claim a thing that men have stopped defending. Most of what a person could see was ruin. Clara did not look at most of what a person could see. She had been taught to look the way her grandfather looked, which was past the surface of a thing and into its bones, and so she set her flour sack on the dry part of the bank, and she walked the canted deck slowly, end to end, twice, feeling the boat shift under her weight and listening to how it answered. She looked at the line where the deck met the cabin wall, and at the way the boat sat in the water, and she understood within the first quarter hour that the houseboat was not sinking from a wound in its bottom. It was sinking because it was meant to look as though it were. That was the first thing the river told her, and it told her in a language her grandfather had taught her to read. A boat that fills through a sprung seam settles evenly the way a cup fills. This boat settled wrong. It sat heavy at one end and light at the other, heavier than its own ruin could account for, as though something dense had been built into the low end and the water had been let in around it to hide the weight. She stood on the canted deck with the water at her ankles, and she thought about her grandfather saying that the skill was in building a box that told no one it had a bottom under its bottom. And, she thought, for the first time in many days, that the long walk had not been for nothing. She did not have the luxury of wondering long. She had $2 gone and nothing to replace it, and the boat she now owned was full of river. Before she could learn anything, she would have to keep the thing from going all the way under, and that meant labor, and the labor meant she needed a place to stand and tools beyond the ones in her leather roll, and the goodwill of at least one person in a place that had laughed at her. She got the first of these by walking back up the bank to the store and spending part of her remaining nothing on the right to sleep in the loft above it. She got the second by being honest about what she needed. And she got the third, in the end, from an old man she had not expected. His name was Moses Tandy, and he was the only soul at Stell's Bend who had not laughed. He was a black man somewhere past 70 who had worked the river since before the war, first as a deckhand and then, when his knees gave out, as a keeper of the landing's 2 skiffs and a mender of nets and a man who knew where everything was and how everything had come to be there. He had watched the auction from the doorway of his shed with his arms folded, and when Clara came up the bank, he had looked at her hands, the stained, scarred hands of a person who worked, and he had decided something about her that the men in hats had not bothered to consider. He came down to the boat that evening while she was sounding the hull with a length of cane, and he stood on the bank and watched her work, and after a while he said that the man who built that boat had been a craftsman, and that it was a shame to see good work drowned. Clara said that the man who built it had been her grandfather. Moses Tandy was quiet a moment. Then he said that he had known Elias Hale, a long time ago, that Elias had come down to the bend more than once in the old days to do work for the men who ran the cotton off the river, and that he had not been back in 20 years. He looked at the boat differently after that. He asked her what she meant to do. Clara said she meant to raise it. He looked at the canted deck and the brown water moving through the lower cabin and the willows already growing up through the stern rail, and he did not tell her she was a fool. He asked her when she wanted to start. They started at first light. To raise a boat that does not want to be raised is not a single act but 100 small ones, and Clara performed them in an order her grandfather had drilled into her until it was as natural as breathing. First, she had to find where the water was coming in, and she found, as she had suspected, that there was no honest wound at all. There was instead a wooden plug, a bored hole through the hull at the low end, fitted with a tapered cypress stopper that someone had drawn loose. Whoever had sunk this boat had wanted it to go down slow and look like rot, and they had bored a hole and pulled the plug and let the river do the rest. She drove the plug home with the heel of her hand and a wooden mallet, and the inflow stopped, and that was the first day's true discovery, though she said nothing of it to anyone but Moses. A boat does not scuttle itself. Someone had wanted this one on the bottom. The second day and the third and the fourth were given over to the water already inside, and there is no craft in that, only labor. The labor of a hand pump worked until the shoulders burn and the back locks and the hands blister and then split and then go numb. The pump was an old brass-cylindered thing Moses kept in his shed against the spring floods, and it wheezed and sucked and threw a thin, steady gout of brown water over the rail with every stroke, and a stroke was nothing, and 1,000 strokes was nothing, and 10,000 strokes began slowly to be something. Clara wrapped her split palms in strips torn from an old feed sack and worked through the wrapping until it soaked through dark. Moses worked the pump in turns with her, the two of them trading off through the long delta days, while the cicadas roared in the willows and the heat came off the brown water in sheets, and the mosquitoes rose at dusk in clouds that drove them to burn green willow for the smoke. They spoke little while they worked. There was nothing to say that the work did not say better. They pumped and the boat rose, a finger's width a day, then two, the stern deck lifting clear, then the lower doorsill, then at last the floor of the lower cabin breaking the surface, streaming and black with river mud. By the end of the fourth day the houseboat sat level for the first time in years, riding low and heavy still, but riding, and Clara stood on its deck in the last light with her hands wrapped in rag and looked at the thing she had bought, and felt the first plain satisfaction she had felt in a long while. The men at the store had stopped laughing. They had started instead to watch, and a watching man is only a man who has not yet decided what he has seen. It was the weight that drew her down into the lower cabin once the water was out, the wrongness in how the boat sat, even now that it floated free. The lower cabin was a low, dark room the length of the hull, its walls furred with mud, its single small window choked with silt. It had been a living space once. There was the rusted frame of a stove, and the rotted remains of a bunk, and a table swollen and split by its long drowning. And there was, along the whole of the low end where the boat had sat heaviest, a built-in bench or chest that ran the width of the hull, a thing she had taken at first for a simple locker. She knelt in the mud and put her hands on it and knew at once that it was not simple. The joinery was her grandfather's. She would have known it blindfolded, the particular way he cut a dovetail, the particular grace of it, and her breath caught to find his hands here in this drowned, dark room 20 years after he had last come to this bend. The chest was locked, and the lock was iron, and the iron had been 20 years in the river. Here is where another person, a person without her inheritance, would have taken a bar to it and torn the lid and ruined whatever lay inside. In the tearing, Clara did not. Her grandfather had taught her that a lock is a kind of question, and that you answer it by understanding it, not by breaking it, and she sat in the mud with a lantern and studied the lock for the better part of an hour before she touched it. She wiped the silt from its face with her thumb, and held the lantern close, and read it the way she would read a difficult passage of grain in a board she meant to cut. It was a box lock of his own making. She saw the casework, his, the proportions his, and it had a keyhole that was a lie, a false ward set in plain sight to tempt a thief's pick, and the true mechanism was released from beneath by a wooden trip concealed in the chest's own framing. She had seen him build such a thing once on a winter evening in the Memphis shop, his hands moving in the lamplight while he explained that a lock everyone can see is a lock everyone will attack, and that the safest door is the one no one knows is a door. She found the trip where she knew to look for it, in the underside of the front rail, worn smooth by a thumb that had pressed it many times. She pressed it. Something inside the iron gave, softly, after 20 years. The lid came up. What lay inside, sealed under a fitted cypress lining that had kept the river out for 2 decades, was not gold. Clara had not let herself hope for gold, and she did not find it, and she was not sorry. What she found was paper. The chest was packed with documents, wrapped in oilcloth and laid in order, dry as the day they were sealed, and the cold, close air of 20 years sealed away rose up out of the chest into her face as she lifted the first bundle. There were ledgers, there were deeds, there were bills of lading and receipts and letters, hundreds of them, and a single thick book bound in black leather that proved to be a register, kept in 2 hands, of every load of cotton that had gone off the Stell's Bend landing between 1862 and 1867, and what had been paid for it and to whom, and what had been recorded in the company books as paid instead. She did not understand all of it. That first night she understood enough to know that her hands were shaking, and that it was not from the labor. The papers in that chest were the bones of a theft, not a theft of one man from another, but a theft of a great many people, by a few, carried out not with a gun but with a pen, over years, in the careful columns of a ledger. And her grandfather Elias Hale, who had built the chest, and locked it with a lock that answered only to someone who knew its secret, had gathered these bones and sealed them and sunk them in a boat in the river, and had waited, dying, to send his granddaughter a letter telling her where to dig. That is the kind of thing that changes the size of a life. Clara had come to the river with $2 and a flour sack, meaning only to see what an old man had left her. She had thought, if she let herself think it, that perhaps there would be a little money, enough to start again somewhere. Instead, she had raised a drowned boat and opened a locked chest and found inside it the buried proof of an old and enormous wrong. And she understood, sitting in the mud with the lantern guttering, that her grandfather had not left her a gift. He had left her a task. Have you ever been handed a thing you did not ask for and known, the moment it was in your hands, that you could not put it down? That was the weight, Clara felt that night, heavier than the boat had been. To understand what the ledgers proved, Clara needed someone who remembered the years they covered, and for that she went to Moses Tandy, who had been at the Bend through all of it. They sat in his shed the next evening with the black register open on a barrel between them, and an old kerosene lamp throwing their shadows up the plank wall, and Clara watched the old man's face change as he read down the columns by the trembling light. He had been a young man in those years, he said. He had loaded much of the cotton in that book with his own hands. The names of the planters he knew, and the names of the freedmen who had worked shares after the war and were owed their portion of what the cotton brought, and he knew the way everyone at the Bend had always known, without being able to prove it, that the portion had never come. The cotton had gone upriver, the money had gone into the books of the Delta Mercantile and Factorage Company, and the men and women who had grown it and picked it and were owed for it had been told year after year that the accounts did not balance in their favor, that they were in fact in debt, that they owed the company for seed and tools and the roof over their heads, and that they must work another year to clear it. They had worked many another year. The debt had never cleared. It had been designed never to clear. The man who had designed it was named Hollis Garrick, and in the spring of 1887 he was the richest man in that part of the Delta and a pillar of the county, a man who had turned the Delta Mercantile into a cotton empire and himself into a figure no one crossed. He had been a young factor's clerk during the war and a company director after it, and the false ledger Clara now possessed showed in his own recorded hand in the early years the exact mechanism of the thing. A true accounting kept in one book for the men at the top, and a false accounting kept in another for everyone else. The difference between them flowing year on year into the company's holdings, and Garrick's own. Clara's grandfather had been the company's carpenter in those years. He had built their counting house and their strong boxes, and she now understood had at some point built or repaired the very cabinet in which the true books were kept, and had seen what was in them, and had been unable to forget it. Moses told her the rest of it, the part that was not in the ledgers. He told her that 20 years before, a freedman named Caesar Lott, who had grown cotton on the Garrick lands, and kept his own careful tally of what he was owed against what the company claimed, had begun to talk quietly of taking the matter to a federal court in the days when such a thing was briefly possible. He told her that Caesar Lott had gone out on the river one night to fish and had not come back, and that the company had called it a drowning, and that no one had ever been able to say otherwise. And he told her that Elias Hale had left the bend for good not long after, in a hurry, in the night, and had never returned, and that Moses had always wondered why a man would leave good work and never come back. Now he knew. Elias had taken the proof and run, and he had hidden it where only his own blood, taught his own secret, could ever find it. And he had waited until he was dying to send for her, because to send for her sooner would have been to send her into the same river that took Caesar Lott. Clara sat with that a long time. The boat she had raised was her grandfather's last word to her, and the word was not a kindness. It was a trust. She thought of Caesar Lott going out on the dark water and not coming back, and she thought of the men along the bank who had laughed at her $2, and she understood that she was now the only living person who held the proof of what had been done to the people of that country, and that the man who had done it was still alive and still powerful 11 miles upriver, and that proof in the wrong hands is only a heavier kind of danger. She did not weep. She was not the weeping kind. She wrapped the ledgers back in their oilcloth, and she thought about her grandfather's other teaching, the one he gave her when she was small and impatient, and wanted to force a joint that would not seat. You do not win against the grain, he had told her. You learn its direction, and you work with it, and the wood gives you what you could never have torn from it. She would not go to Hollis Garrick. She would not accuse him, or confront him, or stand in his counting house and name his crime to his face, because she had seen what the river did to a man who talked, and because an accusation is only words, and words could be answered by a man with lawyers and money and a county in his pocket. She would do instead what her grandfather had done and what the wood had taught her. She would work with the grain of the thing. The proof was physical. It was undeniable. It did not need her to argue it. It needed only to be placed where it could not be ignored in hands that had standing to act. And so she began, quietly, over the weeks that followed, to find those hands. The first pair belonged to a man Moses knew, a circuit lawyer named Whitfield, who came through the county 4 times a year, and who had once, as a younger man, tried to bring a case against the Delta Mercantile and had been broken for it, run out of his practice and nearly out of the state. He was an old man now, and a careful one, and when Clara found him at the county seat and laid a single page of the false ledger on the table before him, his hands went still, and he asked her, very quietly, where she had got it. She told him. He looked at her a long time. Then he told her that what she had was the one thing the company had always been able to count on never existing, which was a true record kept in the company's own hand, and that with it a thing that had been impossible for 20 years became merely difficult. He warned her of the danger. He did not pretend it away. He told her plainly that the last man who had carried a complaint against the Delta Mercantile into a courtroom had lost his practice, his house, and very nearly his life, and that the man had been himself 20 years younger and surer of the world. He told her the company no longer needed to break a person in the open. It had learned to do its work in quieter ways, and a woman alone on a boat at a half-dead landing was an easy thing to make quiet. He laid all of it before her, the way she had laid the ledger page before him, holding nothing back. Then, having said it, he agreed to help, and the careful, slow machinery of the law began to turn, the way the boat had risen, a finger's width at a time. There were setbacks. There are always setbacks, and the worst of them came in the heat of midsummer, when word of what Clara had found began, despite all their care, to move along the river the way word does. A fire took the store loft where she had first slept, in the night, and might have taken her had she not by then moved aboard the houseboat. A man she did not know came to the bend asking after the woman who had bought the sinking boat, and asked his questions in a way that was not friendly, and Moses sent him off down a wrong road and sat up that night with a shotgun across his knees, not aimed at anyone, only resting there, a tool against the dark. Clara understood that the danger was no longer a thing that might come. It had come. And she did the only thing that made sense, which was to make the proof impossible to destroy, by making it no longer rare. She and Whitfield, over 3 sleepless days, copied the most damning of the ledgers in full, by hand, and the copies went to 3 different places the company could not reach all at once, and only then did Clara breathe again. A thing that exists in one place can be burned. A thing that exists in 4 cannot. The grain of the thing carried it the rest of the way slowly through the late summer and into the fall. The true ledgers, set beside the company's filed accounts, proved the theft on their own, in figures no lawyer could argue around, and the copies meant the proof could not be made to vanish, and the names in the register meant that the people who had been wronged, those still living and the children of those who were not, could be found and named and counted. Hollis Garrick was never arrested in any dramatic way, never confronted on the courthouse steps, never made to stand and hear his crime read aloud while a crowd looked on. That is not how such things truly end. What happened was quieter and in its way far worse for a man like him. The federal court took the records. The company's accounts were opened and examined by men Garrick could not buy. And one cold morning in November, the thing he had built on a foundation of 2 ledgers, one true and one false, simply came apart, because the true one had been raised from the river bottom by a woman he had never heard of, and there was nothing left for him to stand on. He left the county before the worst of it. Where he went, Clara never learned and never cared to. A man who builds his whole self on a lie becomes, when the lie is taken from him, almost nothing at all, and the river closed over his name the way it had closed over the boat. The part that mattered to Clara was not Garrick's undoing. It was the restitution, and it came not as a single grand act, but as a long, slow settling. Debts named and acknowledged one by one, the way her grandfather had taught her to seat 100 small joints to make a sound whole. The court ordered the company's holdings examined and the false debts struck. And over the following 2 years, more slowly than justice should ever move, but more surely than it ever had before in that country, the families named in the black register began to receive what the columns proved they had been owed. It was not made whole. A thing like that is never made whole. The years could not be given back, nor the lives spent working a debt that had been built never to clear, nor Caesar Lot, who had gone out on the dark water for keeping his own honest tally. Yet his name was entered into the record of the case, and the wrong done to him was named at last in a place where naming it mattered, and his granddaughter, a girl of 19 who had grown up believing her grandfather a man who drowned fishing, learned that he had been something else, a man who had kept faith with the truth and paid for it, and that the faith had not, in the end, been wasted. Clara found that granddaughter herself in the 2nd year in a cabin upriver, and she gave her the page of the register where Caesar Lot's tally was set against the company's lie, and she watched the young woman read it, and she did not make a speech. She only said that her own grandfather had built the box that kept this safe, and that he would have wanted the girl to have the page. The girl held it a long time. Then she asked Clara what she should do with it. Clara told her that was hers to decide. Some things are kept and some things are given, her grandfather used to say, and the wisdom is in knowing which is which. She had given this one. The men at Stell's Bend came around in the way that such men do, not all at once, and not with any grand apology, but quietly, a little shamed over the months that the truth worked its way through the county. Horace Pruitt, the auctioneer who had said she owned the only boat in Mississippi that came with its grave dug, found occasion to remark to anyone who would listen that he had known there was something to that boat, that he had practically given it to her as though the $2 had been a kindness on his part rather than a joke. Clara let him have it. The work had spoken for her, and she did not need to add her own voice to it, and her grandfather had warned her more than once against the smallness of telling people they had been wrong. The man in the stovepipe hat tipped it to her on the bank one morning. She nodded back and went on with what she was doing, which was caulking a seam, because the boat was hers now, and she meant to keep it sound, for she did keep it. That was the thing none of them had expected, least of all Clara herself. She had come to the river to collect an inheritance and leave, and instead, the inheritance had turned out to be the river itself, and the boat, and the work. She had no money to speak of even after it was all done. She had refused, when Whitfield raised it, to take any portion of the restitution for herself, on the grounds that she had not been the one wronged and would not be the one paid, and the lawyer had argued and then given up, and then, she thought, respected her the more for it. What she had instead was the houseboat, raised and dried and made sound with her own hands, and the labor of an old man who had become, somewhere in that long summer, the nearest thing to family she had left. She and Moses worked the boat together after that, carrying small freight and people up and down the lower bends, the cotton money long since other people's business, the two of them making an honest plain living on the brown water that had tried so hard to take the boat down. Moses Tandy lived 4 more years, and they were, he told her near the end, the best of his long life, because for the first time he had been part of setting something right that he had watched go wrong with his own eyes when he was too young and too powerless to stop it. He died in the loft above the store, rebuilt by then, with Clara holding his hand the way she had held her grandfather's, and she buried him on the high ground above the bend where the willows did not reach, and she put up a marker she cut and lettered herself, and the lettering was plain and true and deep enough to last. She lived a long time on the river after that. She never married, and she was not lonely in the way the men at the bend had assumed a woman alone must be, for she had her work and her boat and the slow company of the water. And in time she took on a boy, an orphan off the levee with quick hands and no people, and she taught him the trade the way it had been taught to her. The reading of grain and the logic of locks and the patience that is the whole of the craft. She taught him that any fool could build a box, and that the skill was in building one that told no one it had a bottom under its bottom. She taught him that you do not win against the grain. And she taught him, without ever saying it was the most important thing, that a true record kept in an honest hand is the heaviest thing in the world, heavier than iron, heavy enough to raise a sunken boat and bring down a man who thought himself a county, and that the things the world throws away in the brown water are sometimes the only things that tell the truth. The chest itself she kept. She emptied it of its papers, in the end all of them gone to where they could do their work, and she scrubbed the river mud from the cypress and oiled the wood her grandfather had cut and fitted, and she set it in the cabin of the houseboat where the morning light came in off the water and lay across the grain. The false keyhole was still there, the lie set in plain sight, and the wooden trip beneath the front rail, worn smooth now by 2 thumbs that had known where to press. Sometimes on a still morning she would run her hand along the lid and find the dovetails her grandfather had cut, and she would think of the long walk from the railhead and the 2 silver dollars and the laughter that had stopped, and she would feel not triumph, for she was not a triumphant woman, but the plain settled certainty of a thing made right. The river went on the way it always had, brown and patient and giving nothing freely. The boat, though, rode sound upon it, year after year, and the chest sat in the light, empty now, and harming no one, a thing built to keep a secret that had at last been let out, and that was enough. That was more than enough. If this story moved you, sit a moment with the people in your own life who kept faith with the truth when it cost them, and carry their names a little further down the water. There are other stories like this one waiting, other dismissed things with the truth locked inside them, and the river is long. She died old, in the cabin in the morning light, with her hand resting on the lid of her grandfather's chest. The boy she had raised a grown man by then with quick-scarred hands of his own, found her so, and he did not move her hand for a long while. Then he pressed the trip beneath the front rail, the way she had taught him, and the lid came up soft, the way it always had. Inside there was nothing but the clean smell of cypress and oil, and a single sheet of paper she had left there, on which she had written, in a plain, deep hand, the name Elias Hale, and beneath it the name Caesar Lott, and beneath that the name Moses Tandy. The three of them, set down together at last in an honest record, owed nothing now and owing nothing. Kept safe in a box that told no one it had a bottom under its bottom.